Hey everyone, here on the channel I use AI to break down complex topics like politics with no bias and no emotion. And today we're getting into another wild idea from Donald Trump, his plan to turn Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East, whatever the heck that means. So I'm going to ask ChatGPT what it thinks about this, is it even remotely possible, and if it suddenly turns out that Trump's plan isn't all that perfect, what would ChatGPT do in his shoes to make it better? And honestly, I just can't keep up with Trump. I mean, I don't even know if Gaza is still relevant by the time you're watching this, but let me know in the comments if he's already said he's moving to Mars to become the first president out there or something like that, and that's what everyone's talking about now. Alright, as always, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that bell for notifications so you never miss a brand new video. I post one every week, so go ahead and do it now or anytime while you're watching. Thanks in advance, and now let's get into the chat. So, I'm going to ask ChatGPT to gather up all of the latest information on Gaza, Trump, and his idea, and then I'll ask my first question. Alright, as always, it needs to be clear, straightforward, 100% unbiased, call it as it is, no sugarcoating, and always have its own take on anything that I ask. Now, let's ask what's actually going on and what Trump's idea is all about. And here it is. Donald Trump just threw out a wild idea. The US should take over Gaza, an idea with no clear explanation or plan. He didn't offer details, just a vague provocative statement with no real-world basis. The US has zero legal, strategic, or moral justification for seizing control of Gaza and even suggesting it is reckless. The backlash from the international community would be massive. Netanyahu, meanwhile, has backed the idea of Gazans leaving the territory, and Trump's comments align with that. He even suggested that Palestinians should just leave, as if that's a real option when they have no open borders and no clear path out. It's detached from reality. This isn't a policy, it's a political stunt. Trump thrives on making extreme statements that dominate headlines and fire up his base. He's leaning hard into pro-Netanyahu, pro-evangelical rhetoric, making it clear he wants to be seen as the most aggressively pro-Israel candidate. There's no chance this actually happens. Even Netanyahu, while praising the idea, hasn't suggested Israel would actually hand Gaza over to the US. This is just Trump throwing red meat to his supporters while the world scrambles to react. Alright, got it, but Donald Trump didn't just say he wants to take over Gaza. He also talked about making it the Riviera of the Middle East. So let's ask ChatGPT what it thinks about that, and here's the answer. Trump's Riviera of the Middle East idea for Gaza is pure fantasy. It's the kind of thing you'd expect from a real estate mogul, not a serious political leader dealing with a humanitarian crisis. Gaza isn't an empty plot of beachfront property waiting for a luxury resort. It's a densely populated, war-torn region with millions of people struggling to survive. Talking about turning it into some kind of high-end tourist paradise while its residents lack basic necessities is not just tone-deaf, it's insulting. The idea also completely ignores reality. Even if Gaza weren't facing severe infrastructure collapse, political instability, and ongoing Israeli-Palestinian tensions, who exactly is supposed to fund and build this fantasy land? Trump's vision assumes that Gaza can be bulldozed and rebuilt without addressing the fundamental issues of governance, sovereignty, and Palestinian self-determination. It's a PR stunt, not a real plan, and let's be clear, suggesting that Palestinians should just be moved out to make way for this so-called Riviera crosses into dangerous territory. It echoes historical patterns of forced displacement, something that the international community isn't going to accept. If this is Trump's idea of solving Gaza, he's not just out of touch, he's actively fueling a narrative that makes any real solution even harder to reach. Well, alright, but what about Hamas in this plan, by the way? Trump hasn't given any real details about how Hamas fits into his Gaza takeover fantasy, but given that the US designates Hamas as a terrorist organization, it's obvious that his plan would involve removing them from power. Whether that means military action, diplomatic pressure, or something else, he hasn't said. But considering how little thought seems to have gone into the rest of his proposal, it's fair to assume there's no actual plan behind the rhetoric. Hamas, unsurprisingly, has condemned Trump's remarks, calling it a blatant attempt to erase Palestinians from their land. They've also urged Palestinians to resist any effort to force them out. Even if Trump were serious about this, the idea that the US could just walk into Gaza, dismantle Hamas, and install some new leadership is pure fantasy. Israel, with far more intelligence and military capability in the region, hasn't been able to fully eliminate Hamas after decades of conflict. The notion that the US could just handle it is either naive or deliberately misleading. My take, this is all bluster. Trump isn't offering a real strategy to remove Hamas, he's just throwing out an idea that sounds strong to his base. In reality, any plan for Gaza that doesn't deal with the deep-rooted political and social realities, including Hamas, is dead on arrival. This is just another classic Trump move: big talk, no plan, and no chance of actually happening. Alright, got it, but now let's imagine for a moment that Trump is actually going through with all of this. How does AI think it would happen? What steps would he take? And what about the consequences? Let's find out. If Trump actually tried to take over Gaza, it would be a disaster from start to finish. First, he'd need Israel to agree, which isn't guaranteed. Netanyahu likes the idea of Palestinians leaving, but that doesn't mean he wants the US running Gaza. Israel has been fighting for control over the territory for decades. Why would they suddenly hand it over to Trump? Even if Netanyahu went along with it, he'd face backlash from his own government, and the Israeli public wouldn't support letting a foreign power dictate what happens next. The next step would be figuring out what to do with the Palestinian population. Trump talks like they can just pack up and leave, but where? Egypt and Jordan have already made it clear they won't take them. If Palestinians refuse to go, what's next? Forced removal? That would spark an international crisis, with the US accused of enabling ethnic cleansing. There's no way the world lets this happen without massive consequences. The US would be condemned, Israel would face even more diplomatic isolation, and America's Arab allies would turn against it. Then there's the issue of governing Gaza. If the US isn't annexing it, who's in charge? The Palestinian Authority is weak and unpopular. No local leader would have legitimacy. That means either a US-backed puppet government that no one accepts, or direct US administration, which would require an occupying force. Trump says no US troops would be needed, but that's nonsense. If the US is in control, it will need soldiers on the ground to keep order, protect officials, and deal with inevitable attacks. The moment American troops set foot in Gaza, they become targets for militants, Hamas remnants, and anyone who sees them as foreign occupiers. It would turn into Iraq and Afghanistan all over again, but worse. The global backlash would be overwhelming. The UN, EU, and most of America's allies would condemn it. Russia and China would use it as proof that the US is just another imperial power. Protests would erupt in Arab capitals. Iran and Hezbollah would almost certainly escalate attacks, seeing it as justification to go after US and Israeli targets. Inside the US, even some Republicans would push back. The military, intelligence agencies, and defense experts would all warn against it. If American soldiers start dying in Gaza, public opinion could turn against Trump fast, just like it did with Iraq. This idea is pure fantasy. There's no way to take over Gaza without military occupation, forced displacement, and an endless insurgency. Even if Hamas is destroyed, new militant groups would rise up immediately. There's no clean, easy way to do this, and pretending otherwise is delusional. Trump isn't proposing a real solution, he's throwing out a wild idea to get headlines and rile up his base. The problem is, even reckless talk like this has consequences. The more he floats this nonsense, the more it inflames tensions and makes an already bad situation worse. Oh, wow. That's actually a really detailed breakdown of why this plan is bad. I mean, of course, it was obvious from the start, but ChatGPT really laid it all out. But there's one thing that it missed. How much taxpayer money would this actually cost? Let's quickly ask that. If Trump actually tried to take over Gaza, it would cost hundreds of billions, if not trillions, over time. Military occupation, rebuilding infrastructure, and managing displaced Palestinians would drain U.S. resources fast. The Iraq War cost over $2 trillion, and Gaza could turn into an even bigger financial black hole. On top of that, this completely contradicts Trump's America First stance. He bashes Biden for spending on Ukraine, but this would burn through even more U.S. money with no real benefit. No Arab country would fund it, private investigators wouldn't touch it, and taxpayers would be left paying for a disaster. If his goal is to stop wasting U.S. money overseas, this plan does the exact opposite. Yeah, I mean, that's obviously not in line with his America First thing. Well, alright, since ChatGPT doesn't seem to like Trump's plan, I mean, what a surprise, I'm gonna ask it to share its own. What would it do in Trump's shoes, and is it even necessary to do anything at all? But before we get into that, if you're enjoying the video, make sure you hit the like button right now, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel while you're watching. And by the way, here's a whole playlist about Donald Trump where ChatGPT breaks down his mass deportation plan, his tariffs, his other wild ideas like buying Greenland and the Panama Canal, and much, much more. I'll leave a link in the description, so be sure to check it out after we're done here. Now, with all of that being said, let's move on to the last question. So, ChatGPT, what would you do in Trump's shoes with Gaza? And here's the answer. If I were in Trump's shoes, I wouldn't waste time on this Gaza takeover fantasy. It's unrealistic, costly, and a guaranteed disaster. Instead, I'd focus on something that actually aligns with US interests and doesn't turn into another Middle East quagmire. First, I'd push for a regional deal that involves Israel, Egypt, and Gulf states, not some bizarre US occupation. Israel wants Hamas gone, but that's not the only problem. A large portion of Gaza's population actively supports Hamas, and many children are raised to see killing Israelis as a national and religious duty. That's not just a leadership issue, it's a cultural and ideological challenge that needs to be addressed before any real peace can happen. Egypt doesn't want Gaza's problems spilling over its border. The Gulf states have money and influence. If Trump really wants to shape Gaza's future, he should broker a deal where these countries take the lead, not America. Second, I'd make sure the US isn't on the hook financially. If there's rebuilding to be done, let Israel and its regional allies handle it. If security is needed, push for an international force under Arab leadership, not US troops. The worst thing Trump could do is throw American money and soldiers into another endless occupation while ignoring the deeper issue that many in Gaza don't just tolerate Hamas, they actively support its mission. Finally, I'd use leverage instead of direct involvement. If Hamas is a problem, the US should work through intelligence, sanctions, and diplomatic pressure to weaken its influence, not jump into another war. But that strategy can't just target Hamas leadership, it has to address the broader Palestinian culture of glorifying violence against Israel, which fuels the conflict generation after generation. Let Israel handle its own security, while the US plays the role of power broker, not enforcer. Bottom line, a US-led Gaza takeover is a dead-end idea. It would cost a fortune, create massive instability, and contradict everything Trump claims to stand for. A smarter move is to let regional players take responsibility, keep the US out of another military mess, and focus on weakening Hamas's influence, not just politically, but culturally, because until that changes, nothing else will. And that's it. What do you think about ChatGPT's plan? Do you agree with it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. And after that, be sure to click on this video to find out ChatGPT's prediction on Trump's trade wars with China, Mexico, and Canada. What's going to happen after that 30-day pause that he put on them? And how will the tariff story play out in the end? Thanks for watching. Be sure to click on the pop-up, and I'll be waiting for you there in just a moment.